Hi, it's Carolyn here, and I am happy to share with you a look at how I like to bind my big stitch coasters. After you have your coasters quilted, I've got several here. You'll want to figure out what kind of binding you're going to use for the outside. You can go a few different directions with this. I made these that have matching binding, so it's the same fabric for all of them. Whichever direction you'll go, you need about 18 inches worth of binding for one coaster, so either multiply that times however many you've made or consider that individual number if you're going to scrap it up like I did here. So in this one, this set, all of the bindings are different, which I think is really fun, so you can kind of go either direction with that. For this set here, I'm going to go for the scrappy approach, which I like. And so I've got a few different coasters here. And then I have some different fabrics picked out so I'm going to do that one with that one, match them up like that. Just to go over some of the tools that we're going to be using to attach the binding. First, you want to have a binding tool. I'm going to be making my own binding. If you can go ahead and buy store-bought, pre-made binding if you want, but if you're going to be making your own, I've got the binding tools, the Clover 25 millimeter. I'm going to use the seam roller a few times, so I've got that. I've got my Quilted Coasters, binding fabrics. I'm going to be using some sewing pins. You'll need some thread for not only attaching the binding to the front, but then the hand stitching part in the back. I typically like to match my thread to the back, so I've got two different colors there. Some snips, got a hand sewing needle here, and then some thread gloss for when I'm hand stitching. Since I'm going to be making my own binding strips, I have a scrap of fabric. This was just kind of a leftover, but I went and I cut my strips using the ruler, finding the 45-degree line. So the selvage was here, and I'm going to line up the 45-degree angle here, and then you cut your strips. And so I cut two strips, and together they are more than 18 inches, which is enough for one. You're going to match your ends up so that there's roughly 1/4 of an inch from there to there. And I'm going to sew from that point to that point. Just a regular stitch length. I've set mine at about a 2. Back stitch at the beginning and the end, and then you can trim your little points. And at this point, I like to use the seam roller and press that open. That just makes it easier to press at the iron, and I'm less likely to burn my fingers. Now that I've got my seam put together, I'm going to press it. Press it on the side. Get it nice and flat. And then you're going to grab your tape maker, and then with wrong side facing up, you're going to feed it through that little slit there. I find that when the strips are thicker like this, they tend to come through pretty easily, but if you're ever having trouble getting that tip to point out, all you have to do is just grab a pin, and then you can kind of usually feed it through a little bit that way, and then you've got the leverage to pull. So, wrong side up, I'm going to put it through the tape maker like that, pull it through, then I lay it flat, and then you're just going to kind of get it started. Be careful not to burn your fingers. I am using steam because I really like a crisp bias tape. Once you get to the seam here, just be careful that you're keeping that seam nice and open. and then keep pressing. You can always readjust your tape as you go. Make sure that seam is down, and then give the rest a press. I like really crisp binding, so I tend to press it from the other side too. And I make sure everything's nice and flat, like that. I'm just going to give it a good press from the top. All right, now you've got nice crisp bias tape and you're ready to go. Now we're going to attach the binding to the coaster. I tend to leave this excess stuff on here because it gives me a little bit more leverage to work with, but you could trim it first if that's something that you're more comfortable with. All right, so to start, I'm going to take the binding and I'm going to fold it wrong sides together, and I want kind of at least like a 1/4 or 1/2 inch, and I'm folding it straight. And I get kind of lazy with this. You could trim this to a 90-degree angle. I'll do that later, but for now, and then you'll want to do this on a hard surface. Use the seam roller to get a nice crease in there. And now I'm gonna start pinning it in place. So I'm gonna use my pins, and you see I've pinned the fold there. I'll adjust that in a minute, but I'm just gonna work it around, lining up the edge of my binding with the edge of the coaster. Pinning all of the layers in place. Make sure it's nice and flat. And because that bias has got a little stretch to it, you can really kind of work it out, make it nice and smooth. I'm feeling with my thumb to make sure I won't have any creases, any bumps. Now that I'm getting closer to the beginning, I kind of stop pinning, but I'm working that binding in how it would be, like that. Kind of if I were to continue pinning until I get back to this fold. Now that I'm at the fold, I'm gonna match up these two pieces of binding. I'm gonna make sure that they're not moving, that I'm holding them together, but I'm gonna unpin that. And now you might have to unpin the next one, but first I'm gonna grab these two layers and hold them right together. And I unpinned there just so I can open it up a little bit more. And now, it's a little tricky, but you're gonna flip it over, and then you'll see I've held everything together so nothing shifted. I'm gonna align the straight edge here with the straight edge on this other side, like that. And then I'm gonna pin the two layers together. So what's happened here is that I have the two binding strips right sides together. You can see my crease that I made earlier. That's going to be my sewing line. So now I'm going to take that to the sewing machine and stitch it. Okay, so I just sewed my seam at the machine. It might get a little tricky. You've got all this bulk, but just make sure to pull that out of the way, and then you sew the seam along the crease, backstitched at the beginning and the end. And now, see, that was that first angled side. I'm going to take some larger scissors and I just cut that even. So it's, you know, probably about 3/8 of an inch, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch is good enough seam allowance. I'm going to grab my seam roller again and I will press that seam open. Like that. It looks pretty good. And then now you're just going to continue pinning the rest in place. I kind of like to work everything in evenly, and then I might start over here, pinning to make sure that seam allowance is open, and then I'll jump back to this side. Give that a pin, and give this a pin. back over here. Pin and pin. All right, so the next step is we're gonna attach this with the sewing machine, and we're gonna stitch. You can see your crease that was created in the sew line, or by creating the bias tape, and you're just gonna stitch sort of to this side of that crease. So kind of scant in there, and you're gonna go all the way around. All right, so I have everything pinned all the way around the outside, so now I'm gonna stitch it in place. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stitch on this side of the crease, close to the crease, but just inside of it. Alrighty. Guess you could use your walking foot at this point if you'd like. Back to the beginning, back stitch. All right, so now I've got it stitched all the way around in place. Looks good. So now I'm gonna trim this excess off. All right, now that we have it trimmed down, it's all sewn in place, you're gonna flip it around to the other side. And I'm gonna use the wonder clips, and I'm gonna start just on one side. Clip it down. I like to kind of go to opposite sides and work everything around evenly, like that. Since it was cut on the bias, everything should kind of fall in place quite nicely. All right, now you've got it all clipped in place and you're ready to hand stitch it down. Of course, you could do this by machine if you wanted. If I was going to do this by machine, instead of using clips, I would probably use sewing pins, and I would either pull these just over the stitching line and then top stitch kind of 1/8 of an inch in from the seam, or I would pull it in just a little bit more and then stitch in the ditch and making sure that that seam was catching the back side. I have a hand needle that has some thread on it with a knot at the end that I've used some thread gloss with. I'm using this thread because I kind of like to match it to the backing fabric. I feel like that blends in the best. And so to start, I'm going to bring the needle through the fold from the back, And then making sure everything's in place. Now I'm going to grab just a couple bits there and then run my needle. So for here I'm kind of doing more of a ladder stitch, so I'm grabbing a few threads from the backing, and then up above I'm traveling just a few stitches in the binding. And you just keep working your way around, taking out the clips as you come to them. Like that. All right, we're almost back to the beginning. And so I will just continue until I am back to where I started. Oops. And once I get there, now I'm there, I'm just going to make a little knot. I'm going to grab a few threads here from the backing, make a knot, do it again, and I'll make 2 or 3 knots depending on, whatever. So that is good. Now I'm going to trim my thread, and we have a fully bound coaster. Yay! There we go. Not so bad, right? And everything gets better with practice, so just keep giving it a try, and I promise it will get much easier. Let me know what you think in the comments if you have any other questions, and happy sewing!